Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Aldrich, and you can find me online at www.bafosaco.com. Today, I'm going to begin the first of a series of tutorials that are geared towards setting up WordPress for use on the IndieWeb and providing a bunch of additional IndieWeb functionalities over and above what WordPress's core functionality allows. We've done this before, I think in roughly a 2-hour tutorial setup. We walked through installing, setting up a bunch of plugins to do just this. So you can always watch that bigger, longer section. But for those who are doing things in a more step-by-step fashion, I thought I would do a short series of these tutorials that take each of those parts and does them in bite-sized chunks. So the first thing we can do here, most of what we're going to walk through is going to be predicated on the idea that you've got at least some idea of what the IndieWeb is and what it means. Although we'll go over a few of the highlights here in a few minutes. But we're going to presume that you've bought your own domain name. And in my case, I'm going to be using throughout this series a domain name Chris, CHRIS.BOFFOSOCKO.com. That's the domain I'm going to be using, but it will presume you've bought your own. And we'll also presume that you've got your own web hosting of one sort or another. So typically, most domains, unless you're buying something really extravagantly expensive, are going to run you typically anywhere between $10 and $15 a year to register a domain on a domain registrar. Often when you're first buying one, you can typically get a discount for the first year or two of domain registration. And then renewals will generally run in that $10 to $20 range. But typically it's pretty inexpensive. It's much less expensive than most, I think, would presume. And then separately, you'll want a web hosting account of one sort or another. And often I find for personal use, these typically run in the range of anywhere from, I think I've seen as low as $3 or $4 a month and going up to maybe $10 or $20 a month, but often something in the $5 to $15 a month range typically will suit most people in terms of the type of account they'll need and the bandwidth they'll want to support. Certainly, one can go out and buy more expensive packages, but there are thousands and thousands of hosts out there. In fact, there are some hosts that will also do the domain registration portion of the package on your behalf. So you can usually go to one company to get all of these pieces of the puzzle. For those who need a little help, the IndieWeb Wiki at IndieWeb.org will have a handful of suggestions and ideas. Often for beginners, I'll recommend some of the bigger brand name hosts like oneandone.com or GoDaddy is another good one. And there are also kind of smaller, very hands-on hosts like reclaimhosting.com that do an incredibly good job for a very reasonable price. Now, the offerings that some of these companies may have will certainly range from the very much do-it-yourself. You need a master's of science in computer science to be able to use their services. Others will have a very simple set of what you see is what you get type tools that will walk you through all the moving pieces. So there's certainly a range there, and in some sense too, one gets what one pays for. But I think most of the ones I've mentioned have a pretty good, clear setup, and many hosts actually offer a one-click setup for WordPress that you can, with the click of a button, set up all the code you need for your WordPress install, as well as your database to hold all the data. And there's really not much else to do beyond that. So it can be anywhere from a harrowing process to a very easy process, depending on your background and experience. But what I'm going to do for our tutorial here is, typically we're going to try and eschew or stay away from any kind of hard, heavy code. We're going to try and do everything in a pretty simple, easy user interface, so that if you don't know anything about code or CSS or even HTML, we're going to try and skip through all that and do everything as simply and manually as we can, and as simply as we can, so that things are easier for the beginners. So the one thing we won't cover in this tutorial, and there are thousands of videos out there that will show you how to set up and run and take care of your own WordPress install. In fact, probably the best place to start out is .org. There are a bunch of simple details and tutorials for how to get a WordPress site up and running. If you're going to go the more manual route, you can actually click the download and download a copy of the WordPress code and put that up on a server if you wish. But again, I'll recommend for most that you try and find a host that does an easy one-click install, and literally you're ready to go, and you can fill in a few fields of detail and kind of go from there. So for those who don't know about the IndieWeb and what it is, it's a simple concept that's predicated on two things: that you own your own domain, and you're going to run your own website as your online identity. Ideally, most in the IndieWeb community are kind of doing at least these two things as a bare minimum. Others are doing quite a bit more, depending on their level of coding and skill. But here again, we'll try and keep things to the simplest nature. But the IndieWeb is focused on helping you make your content your own, so that you own all of your data and have the ability to easily back it up and potentially restore it if something goes wrong. The IndieWeb is geared towards making you better connected online, so that you can use your website as your primary hub online and communicate with others. This includes being able to easily take your content and syndicate it from your site to other social silos like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google+, LinkedIn, and so on and so on. That way, whether your friends and family have IndieWeb capable sites, you can still interact and communicate with them. The last thing the IndieWeb is geared towards is helping put you in control, so that you can post anything you want in any format you want. No one's going to be monitoring you. No one's going to necessarily be out stealing or monetizing all of your own data. And you're going to share simple, readable URLs, or links, as they're known on the web. And that these permalinks to your content will be available to you to modify, change, edit, delete, and that they'll always work. That way, if you decide some later point in life you want to change web hosts, you want to change service providers, you want to move from hosting a WordPress site to either a static site or a site like with Known or Drupal or any of the thousands of other content management sites, you can take all your data, your domain and all your URLs with you, move them to another location on another server, on another host, and you can make all of those links still work. And in some sense, this also helps drive a much greater amount of innovation, and forces hosts and other service providers to compete with each other at a higher level to provide for services in the long run. So with your domain in hand and hopefully your hosting set up, we'll be able to get along. If you need more details about why you might want to be involved in the IndieWeb, there's a why page on the IndieWeb wiki that will give you a lot of details about how other corporate companies have lost content, been unreliable, caused people to lose their identities, lose their websites, they've been censored, they've allowed content theft, all of these kind of crazy reasons. There's an unending litany of reasons why one might want to be on the IndieWeb. And this page certainly does a pretty good job of all of those. If you're more developer focused, there's a list of principles, driving principles that set up the reason for having an IndieWeb presence and how to build one. A lot of these may not apply specifically to the audience of this specific tutorial. I'll point out one or two I think that are important from our standpoint. Owning your own data obviously is an important one. By having your own WordPress install, everything you post to it is text, data, photos, video, in some sense that you will directly own. You can easily export it out of the system, take it somewhere else. Another thing you may want to consider, since you'll have your own website, you can certainly document how you build and use your website. So once you've got your WordPress site up and running, you can document exactly the steps you took to do it, the changes you made to it, so that either your future self will know how you did it originally, or so that other folks watching you and following you will both know how you did it and they can recreate it for themselves. So this set of video tutorials in some sense not only helps me remember how I set my site up, but hopefully it will help others do much the same off in the future. Because we're building using WordPress, WordPress is an open source project, so all the code is out there and can be used and modified if one wishes. Thousands and thousands of engineers have spent an uncountable number of hours creating a solid UX or user experience and design setup so that WordPress is easier to use. So we'll be taking advantage of this principle as we all go along. And then finally, probably the most important principle is to have fun. So ideally, once our site is up and running and working and it's kind of doing what we want, we can go in and tweak it, add some plugins, change some themes, and we can have fun in terms of making our website our own. And isn't that half the reason to do it in the first place? If one is looking for help about things on the IndieWeb, I'll point out that there's a discuss page on the wiki that will help you find your way into one of the various incarnations of the IndieWeb chat that exists online. The backbone of it is built on IRC. But for those who don't want to set up an IRC client and get involved in all of the Machiavellian machinations of what that entails, you can go here and very quickly click a link to the IndieWeb chat, and we'll give you a quick browser-based experience You can click join the chat and choose your username and immediately pop in and get help in any number of channels, including the main IndieWeb channel, the developer channel. There's a WordPress specific channel that many watching this video may want to jump in and ask questions or ask for help. There's a meta channel for things related to how the IndieWeb wiki is set up, planning events off in the future, and then there's a few other channels in here for other specific uses as well. But if you have a little more technical background, you may prefer to use the IRC chat channel, or you can, if you're familiar with Slack and want to use Slack, there's a Slack gateway. There is also a bridge for using the Matrix tool as well for dovetailing with IndieWeb chat. But all of these different methods of getting into the chat are roughly all equivalent, and the discussion is all the same. It's just the thing that changes is the client that you're using to interact with the setup. And then finally, if you want to get involved a little more deeply, or you want some in-person help, there are a number of IndieWeb or IndieWeb Camp related events throughout the year. There's typically between 3 and 10 IndieWeb camps in any given year throughout the world. And there are a number of homebrew website clubs in probably half a dozen or more cities throughout the world as well. So you may, if you're in a city or near a city that has a homebrew website club, you can stop in and hopefully get some help in person at one of those, or you can show other folks how you got your site up and running and show them new pieces or things you've managed to get working that make your site a little easier to use. So with that said, let's take a quick look at the WordPress side of things. We've already shown you the WordPress.org website, as well as a link to be able to download the WordPress code from the repository. But ideally, you've got a host that has got you set up, got you running, or you've been able to find videos on the web for doing WordPress's infamous 5-minute installation. In fact, I think I did it in about 3 minutes. And after inputting the data to get my installation up and running, I'm presented with a quick welcome screen as I'm installing and setting up WordPress. So we'll go through, and I'm going to use some of my own data and setup to create an IndieWeb instance using WordPress here. So I'm going to start with the site title. I'm going to put in my own name. I'm going to create a username. Do something simple and logical. I'll use my own name for both. We've got a password already in here. I'm going to put in my email. Now you can choose to allow your website to be searchable by search engines like Google and Yahoo and Bing and all of the rest. I'm not going to discourage it, so I'm going to leave this checkbox unchecked, and I'm going to click install. And hopefully, with our fingers crossed, everything has been done properly. 2 seconds later, we've got a success. Let's log into our new website. So I'm going to use that same username and password, and this should let us into our website. So here we are. Welcome to WordPress. We've got now a WordPress site, a basic one, up and running. I've not pre-customized it in any way. It's just as it comes out of the package, downloaded, fresh and new. We're going to customize some things here, but I'm not going to jump through the hoops for the customization on the WordPress side. But instead, what I'm going to do is we're going to begin customizing things really more from the perspective of setting up the IndieWeb customization. And I'll let you use either WordPress's documentation or any number of books one can get from a library to kind of set up and walk you through most of a WordPress install. But my guess is anybody out there who's got a Twitter account or a Facebook account and is able to go through the setup and use of a Facebook account, you'll be relatively comfortable using WordPress, creating content on it, uploading photos and that sort of thing. And the rest of the series, we're going to go through setting up and customizing one of a couple of themes that are IndieWeb friendly. We're going to look at a bunch of plugins, including the IndieWeb plugin, the Web Mention and Semantic Linkbacks plugin. We're going to look at the IndieAuth plugin, the Syndication Links plugin, and plugins for pieces called WebSub and Postkines. And most of the rest of the series should all be freestanding little snippets that you can watch and implement in almost any order. But we'll talk about each of these plugins and theme setups in turn so that you can set them up, get them running. Those that have customizations or settings, we'll be able to kind of walk through those and then show you some examples of how they're used and what functionality they're adding to your website that the average WordPress website typically wouldn't support out of the box. So with that, this will wrap up this first little mini tutorial. Hopefully you've got an idea of what WordPress is from a content management system setup. You've got a slightly better idea maybe of what the IndieWeb is and what it will hopefully empower you to do, and we'll of course cover some of the other moving pieces as we go through each of the plugins and the rest of the series. And ideally, you've got your basic WordPress install set up and ready to go. You've got your domain and your hosting squared away. And you'll be ready to actually begin onboarding into having a more flexible website for yourself on the internet as we proceed through the next few episodes. So until then, this is Chris Aldrich of bafosacco.com, wishing you the best. And again, if you have questions as you go through, feel free to pop your head into the IndieWeb chat that we discussed, and hopefully I or someone else there will be able to give you a little bit of help. But until next time, I'll see you then.